When we check the stitches here, there are 7 long stitches in the center, no increases or decreases, and 2 long stitches on either side. And when we're done with this part, we'll still have the 2 locking stitches as intervals, and then we'll go to the last part of the stitch, and the same thing will happen. 2 long stitches, 2 extra stitches, and the marker button is useless, so take it off. Fifth row, 5th circle. Now that we've finished the 5th row, we'll start on the 6th row, which is basically the same as the 5th row, and we'll just add long stitches to the first and last stitches of these 2 parts, without adding or subtracting in between. Look at the specific. Let's start by flipping the weave. Remember, when we flip the piece, we knit it the same way, skipping the first stitch and extraditing on the second. Seduce and draw the needle, extradite. Hook another one. Continued extradition. Lead it to this. If you count from this side, it's on the penultimate stitch. From here, it's the 3rd stitch, and then 3 locking pins. Beginners, remember to mark and fasten on this 3rd one. Then hook a long stitch. Two locking pins as spacers. To this part, I just said he's crocheting the same way he did in the last round. We'll knit 2 long stitches in the first stitch, which is the extra long stitch. Then in the center is a long stitch that doesn't add or subtract. Then just crochet the long stitches one by one. I'm not going to show you all the repetitions of this one. For the last stitch in this section, we remember to knit the long extra stitch. In the last stitch, you need to knit 2 long stitches. 2 locking pins as spacers. Here we are. Still 3 long stitches in the center stitch. And this is the same for now. After the 3 long stitches in the center are knit, we'll have the same 2 locking stitches as a spacer. And then come to this part. This is the big wing part. Similarly, we're going to knit a long extra stitch on top of the first stitch. In the center, the long stitches are knit one by one. This is an easy place to knit a long stitch to the previous row of stitches. This part is also down to the last stitch. The same long stitches and extra stitches. After the long stitches are added, 2 locking stitches are used as spacers. It's time for the last part. In fact, the beginning and the end of each row are basically the same, so we're going to knit long stitches here, and then we're going to knit long stitches. And then you'll knit a long overlock stitch to create a jagged outline. I'm done with this round. We'll start the 7th loop, and the 7th loop will be a change in the center. So let's take a look at it. But let's turn the piece over. The first one was left empty, the second one seductively plucked. Extradite. Keep pulling, 3 more locking pins. Long needle. Every row starts the same way. Go on. Knit another long stitch and add stitches. 2 locking stitches as a spacer. And when we get to this winged part in the center, in the middle, we'll knit 2 long stitches over the first one in the same way. The center continues to be a long stitch with no increases or decreases. I'm not going to show you all the repetitions. For the big wing, on the last stitch, we're still crocheting long plus stitches, which is 2 long stitches. Knit 2 locking stitches in the same place. Here, instead of knitting in the middle stitch, we'll enter the needle in the first stitch and knit 3 long stitches. Then we'll skip this stitch and knit 3 long stitches on top of the last 3 stitches, and we'll knit 3 long stitches in this position, which is different from the previous one, in order to separate the large wing from the small one. Here too, 2 locking stitches are knit first. After the 2 locks are knitted, we come to the part with the little wings. This circle, this row, is starting to change. We're going to knit a long stitch on the first stitch, which means we're going to knit a decrease from this row. So we're not going to add any more stitches to this row. So we're just going to knit the long stitches one by one. Repeatedly, I won't show you again. Then again, the last stitch will be 1 long stitch, no more long stitches, no more extra stitches. When you check the stitches here, there are 13 long stitches in this row. 2 locking pins spaced apart this part. The ending remains the same. Knit 2 long stitches in a row with extra stitches. Then turn the piece over. The beginning of the section is the same. The first stitch is empty, the second stitch is knit on top of the drawer, and the extra addition begins. The second pull and then 3 locking stitches. Knit another long stitch in the same position to form an extra long stitch. Next, we'll knit a long extra stitch. Two latch stitches as a spacer, and then when we start the decrease from this row, we skip the first stitch. Without knitting on the first stitch, start a long stitch on the second stitch. 1-to-1 correspondence of long needles. Repeat without further demonstration. Same last shot over here. It's not woven either. Leave 2 locking stitches empty. At this point in the last row, where the center divides, we'll leave the first stitch empty, and we'll knit a long extra stitch on the second needle. Next, we'll knit a long extra stitch. This next part is the big wing, so we're going to start splitting it up here, and we're going to leave this part alone. We'll just flip it over here and start with the same thing we did before, extra addition. 3 locking pins. Knit another long stitch. This place is the same. Two locking stitches as a spacer, leave the first stitch empty, and knit long stitches in the middle without adding or subtracting. I won't show you how to do this again. The last stitch of this part is also left empty and not knitted. 2 locking pins for spacing. So here's the weave. It's all the same. Knit 2 long plus stitches in turn. And that's how the row is done. Start the next row with the same flip. It starts in the same place. 2 hooks for extra addition. And then 3 locking stitches, long stitches. Long needles plus needles. 2 locking pins as spacers. Then we come to the middle part of this part that continues to repeat the previous pattern. The first stitch is left empty. The first and last stitches are left empty in the middle, and knit long stitches that do not add or subtract. Repeat the pattern. I will not show you again. Leave the last stitch empty, 2 locking stitches. Knit 2 long stitches in turn. That means that this serrated part, it starts and ends exactly the same, and it's a repeat of the previous weave. Then turn the piece over and pull it out. Three locking pins. This place is an exact repeat of the previous weave. Two locking pins. Remain. Prior laws. Empty first stitch. Knit from the second stitch. A long needle that doesn't add or subtract. I'm not going to repeat myself. The last stitch in this place. It's still empty. Two locking pins spaced out to this last spot. Two long stitches in sequence. The knitting is the same after the flip. Beginning. Drawing extradition on the second. The two locking stitches are spaced apart, and we continue to the wing section, and then we leave the first stitch empty, and we start a long stitch on top of the second stitch, without adding or subtracting anything. I'm not going to repeat myself. Look at this row. There are 3 long stitches left in the center. The fourth and last one is still empty. 2 locking pins. Then turn the piece over. Drawing for extradition line. Here's something to keep in mind. In this position, this row is spaced by a lock stitch, because in the last row there were 3 long stitches left. And in this row the first and last stitches are not knit, so there's the center stitch. Let's change this space locking pin to a locking pin. There's also a lock stitch here, and the crochet method is the same, with 2 long stitches. Then flip it over. Alike. And then when you're done here, weave in a lock stitch. Just start knitting this way. I'm not going to knit in the middle. Directly, this is a locking pin as a spacer. Then 2 long stitches over here. Take a look at the row that looks like this. That's 4 sets of long stitches and a needle. After that, there is a locking pin in the center for spacing. Then turn the piece over. We'll start extraditing for extraction. 1, 2. This place needs a little more pulling. 3. And then you start knitting. 3 locking pins. 1 long pin. 1 locking pin. And then over here, knit a long extra stitch on top of the first stitch and you're done. That's the end of this little wing part. When we're done, we're going to break the threads here, and we're going to weave a band formed by locking stitches. Lengths. It's about 60 centimeters. You can also weave the appropriate length to suit your needs. It's all locking pins. I'm not going to show you all the repetitions. It's all lock stitch.